The question in my mind is, how do you create or relaunch a highly profitable and successful 6 to 7 figure business? With so much conflicting advice about the best ways to start and grow your business, how do you get it right the first time? I want to help entrepreneurs make a real difference and navigate the messy world of startup or relaunch. My name is John North, and this is the Startup Secrets for Entrepreneur Show. Join me today when we dig deep with our guests and get you the best blueprint so you can fast track your own business. This episode is sponsored by Evolvepreneur.app, your all-in-one online business system. Make sure you subscribe for future episodes at startupsecrets.show right now. So let's get into today's episode. You're listening to the Startup Secrets for Entrepreneurs, and I'm your host, John North, and my mission is to help entrepreneurs make a difference and navigate the messy world of startup and relaunch, commonly called a pivot. Join me today when we dig deep with our guests and get the best concepts and strategies to fast track your business. So today's special guest is DKParker from Trajectory Media, and so welcome, Dave, to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Cool. And so we had a bit of a chat off before we started, and it's quite an interesting kind of journey that you're on. And so tell me a little bit of what you do now and how you got to that point.
So my 80% time is doing sell-side merger and acquisition work for helping founders actually land the deal and get the wire transfer into their personal check.
Oh, nice.
Checking account versus getting into their financing check. So that's how I spend the bulk of my time today. But my 20% time, which sometimes is 60% time, is really focused on community building, John, and helping startup founders at the early stage from ideation and then up to kind of product market fit, right? Which is where they don't have any money, and the money they do have, they need to be spending on validation. And part of that came from my background. I'm a 5-time founder and sold 3 and closed 2. But I also had a chance to work at a company called Startup Weekend. And the parent company was called Up Global. So it was the merger of Startup Weekend and Startup America. So we sold that company to Techstars in 2015. But the year before we sold it, we did 1,265 events worldwide.
Wow.
With 74,000 attendees in 120 countries. And
I'm going to try that now.
We did a lot of events. And as an event marketer, I'm still neurotic about events. I'm like, I know 100 people have signed up. I know no one's going to be there. And now post-COVID, we'll see how my neurosis goes. But so my 20% time is really community building and give back, and how do we up-level the entrepreneurs in Seattle, and then also in emerging markets in Middle East and North Africa. So being a 5-time founder, I just kind of found that there's things that, there's 1,000 things that can kill your startup, right? And the best assist I can give most startup founders is helping them to compress that into a 4 to 6 month exercise that says, don't actually fail fast. I think that's a Valley thing. Honestly, I came from a family where failure wasn't an option. So there was no rich uncle to write me a check.
Yeah.
So the concept of kill bad ideas fast, I think, is brilliant, because in that case, you still have the runway to go pivot and go chase a different idea, right? But a lot of founders get augured in on that one first idea, and it's their true love and it's their baby, and they just have trouble being objective about it. So that was kind of the gap I saw coming out of Startup Weekend, because people would come out, they're like, we met each other at Startup Weekend, we're gonna leave our day jobs and we're gonna go do a startup. And I'm like, whoa, before you do that, there's some things you may want to think about. And the original seminar series was called 6 Month Startup. So basically, I would walk people through a set of deliverables, and you could go do that work in the month in between, come back, talk to the mentors. If you didn't do the work, you couldn't talk to the mentors.
Right. Yep.
Right. But if you did the work, the mentors were super supportive. And by month 4, we found we had a very planned churn rate of people who went, aha, I know now what I need to do, and I know how I'm going to make money. And I've talked to 25 customer development interviews, and I found that people don't like this idea. So I'm going to take the framework I've learned, and I'm going to go find a new idea, and I'll see you back at the next time you run the seminar. Nice. So that was the original seminar series that we turned into the book.
And that would probably, in some respects, have save a lot of heartache, a lot of cost, a lot of anguish, a lot of probably broken relationships even in the process.
I always tell people, I'm not ultimately the judge of your startup idea. Like, I'm not your customer, but I, like you, have seen thousands of ideas. And the thing I always remind founders is, like, I'm not the judge of it, but you want to be the first investor. and you want to hold it to a high standard, right? And the high standard is, this is a huge commitment of your time. And hopefully you look at it as the first investor. So should I spend my time on this thing, or should I spend my time on that thing? And to your point, I've had both successes and failures, and everybody's like, well, wasn't it really a failure? And I'm like, no, it was. I didn't return capital to shareholders. That was a failure. And you do learn more from your failures, right? But failures are expensive and time consuming, and you can earn the money back. You just can't get the time back. And I think there's huge value in time.
Yeah, and I mean, it's an interesting thing in Australia right now. We've got went into another lockdown, and businesses are getting destroyed over it because perfectly good businesses, right? And the government says, we'll give you some money, and it's like, well, that's all very well, but the reality is the lost time in your business is so valuable. That month, 2 months of lockdown could have been the pivotal point between your business succeeding and failing, or something else that you're about to sign up for or do something, and then you've lost that momentum. So, timing's everything sometimes.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. I don't know if your audience has seen the Bill Gross video, but he did a video all about, what are the key factors of success. He was the founder of Idea Lab, and probably the best 7 minutes on the internet for on a TEDx talk, right? And it was about really the value of timing, which is interesting because you never have that. You can only look backwards, right, on timing and say, timing was great. And I love VCs because they always said, our timing in that investment was awesome. The VC didn't actually do anything other than write a check. Like, their timing wasn't excellent. They just happened to see an opportunity
at the right place at the right time, right?
Right. But survivorship bias clearly takes over, as does revisionist history, right? And the VCs can be like, our timing in that deal was great. Like, we just really knew that one. I'm like, I don't think so.
I think I'd actually watch a Netflix documentary about the concept of the brain and how the brain tricks you into thinking backwards, and history creates this stuff that's actually didn't really be the way. Like, you ask someone else that that's not the way it was, but
totally.
Your brain's protecting you.
The biggest hindrance in critical thinking is confirmation bias, right? So and the statistics are crazy high on it, for sure.
Yeah. So we talked about the concept that you wrote a book called Trajectory Startups, and there's actually 14. And we haven't got time to go through 14 today, I don't think, but 14 kind of revenue models. What's probably the top couple of 2 or 3 that work the best?
Oh, it's super interesting. So when I wrote the book originally, the thought, John, was like, I just wanted to understand what were the revenue models in tech that made the most sense, right? So I went through and said, there's services companies, and there's commerce companies, and there's subscription companies, and there's metered services companies. And after we published the book, I was talking with a friend, and he's like, have you gone out and done a comparison of the public company comps of all the tech companies? So we pulled down 206 public companies that are all in the tech space and broke them into the 14 revenue models. We actually added a 15th, which is a conglomerate. So if you think of Amazon has AWS with metered services, and they have a marketplace that they make margins, in the form of BIPs, basis points. So those ones like that, we kind of bundled together and said, those are just mega cap stocks. They're definitely huge conglomerates. Cisco is an example, like hardware and software and subscriptions. So we actually broke down the 200 companies and said, how did they compare from an enterprise value perspective? And the way we calculated enterprise value was their market cap at the time of the comparison divided by trailing 12 months of revenue. And interestingly enough, you wouldn't really be surprised. Subscription businesses that are highly dialed in pricing are super high. Now, there's one that's better, right? And that's metered service.
Right.
So think Twilio, think UiPath, Cloudera. So the true cloud native companies that have a metered service. So you buy a subscription in the case of Twilio, and then every text message you send, you pay a metered service. So if Azure existed outside of Microsoft or AWS existed outside of Amazon, they would be a true metered service company. And to give you a sense of multiples there, super interesting. Like if you and I did a $1 million services business, because that's where I spend the most of my time, is people will come and say, hey, what's my company worth, right? And I'm like, $1 million services business is going to sell for roughly $1 million. But $1 million subscription business, even early, could sell for $12 to $15 million. A highly tuned pricing one is going to sell for closer to 25 or 35 times revenues. Wow. And a metered service businesses are running in the mid 40 times revenues. So, you obviously have to get a certain threshold and be a big enough revenue like $1 million isn't the threshold to get you 40x revenues, but
it's a start point.
50 million is. So there's a company here in Seattle that just sold to Twilio recently, and I know the founder, so I applied some math and sent him a note and said, hey, can I estimate where I think your price was for future 12 revenue next year? And he's like, yeah, go for it. And he's like, yeah, it was pretty close. So because those companies can basically forecast revenue super predictably. And so if you have a chance as a startup, you can't force your customers to buy the way you want them to buy, just to be clear. Yes. And if you're a marketplace, you're going to have a transaction fee and you might have a subscription as a combination model. But if you can do a subscription with the ability to have a pay-as-you-go metered service, I would definitely suggest it, because those are the highest 2 return on investments for sure.
So even in,
that's definitely one of my criteria,
right? Even something extra on top, like I guess you look at McDonald's and they sell chips and whatever, that $1 billion upsell. At least if you got something else to upsell, I think that's another thing that I find a lot of small business don't do. They either go one way or the other. They have lots of products and they don't sell any of them really. But then the 80-20 rule usually kicks in eventually. Or they have only a very few number of products and they don't have any upsells, so they don't have any way of taking someone from just one level to another. And I think that's important.
Well, I think that's true, because it's the lesson learned here in being like, I've been learning book marketing. Not a great use of time, by the way.
No, it isn't. It's not. I'll tell you that. I've been there.
I mean, so, but now that I built a list of 25,000 email subscribers, the question is, okay, what else do I sell them? So do I work on a derivative book? Do I co-publish? Do I do, right? Because the answer is, okay, now I have a channel. What products do I put in the channel? Or I have a product, how do I go find a channel? Both of those are great go-to-market strategy questions. And there's not always, marketing is great because marketing is wildly creative. Where sales in general isn't super creative, right? It's
pretty boring, really. Sales is pretty boring in comparison to marketing, right?
Yeah, there's 4 methods for sales. There's innumerable methods for marketing. And then for your audience, there's 14 ways to make money.
So I
always encourage folks just to say, hey, like, hopefully your product is unique, and that's like, maybe a copycat, and copycats actually are really great, but just know that how you make money is never unique.
Right.
So give you an example. In the 5-year span of the data that we looked at, we had, remember Groupon?
Yep.
Right. So Groupon was a combination model. Ultimately, it was a combination model of e-commerce and lead generation. So at the time, it was super hot, right? If everybody remembers, there's thousands of competitors for Groupon. And revenue models you can't build competitive advantage with revenue models. They're public domain. So thousands of companies copied them.
Get your price list.
Yeah. And the multiple of revenue for Groupon these days is 0.47. Right. So for every $1 in revenue they do, their market cap is less than 50 cents.
No, okay. That math doesn't seem right. In terms of not working.
Yeah, I wouldn't, knowing what you know now, the answer was it was incredibly hot, right? And I think that's one of the things we get slightly confused on at times around, like, oh, we're going to go chase this new, like, we're going to be the new Clubhouse. Clubhouse falls into a model that's called what I call new media as compared to old media, right? Mashable is a good example, or ZDNet's an example of old media. But new media is where we have either word of mouth, network effects like WhatsApp, or a true viral coefficient, which 2 years ago was hard to explain to people, and now everybody understands it, right? So ultimately, it's the revenue model that doesn't have to have a revenue model, because we know at this point, almost all of those companies monetize based on advertising.
Yes.
So you're going to get a pre-roll like you do on Twitch, or you do on TikTok. So at some point, Clubhouse is going to have to monetize. But as long as you're growing at a K factor of greater than 2, you're on fire, baby. Right. So I've only had a chance to work with one of those companies. We got to a K factor of 2.03, and it was, unicorn farts and butterfly wings. It was amazing, but incredibly hard business. Right.
And I mean, you look at Clubhouse, like you see that Facebook obviously saw that as a big threat for sure for the eyeballs, and they bring out some audio thing. I think that they've got Vanderchuck actually doing some demo. I think last night they did the first one or something.
Yeah, I've been on the beta version of that as a speaker, and it's audio and video, which makes sense.
Yes.
They're trying it out, and so is Twitter. And anytime I think that's the question is, are you building a social network or are you building a tool?
Yeah.
Right. In their case, they have to build both, which is building a social network's hard. Right. So you got to do customer acquisition better than anybody else.
And the biggest problem with like Zuckerberg is he seems to want to do everything. He wants to be everything. So it's almost like someone puts up a threat for him, and it's like straight away he considers them the enemy. Like I remember him saying that I.
Yeah. If you haven't read the book written by the Instagram the author who wrote about Instagram and the Instagram founders. For your audience, I would highly recommend it.
Right.
It's a brilliant book, and it answers just that question, and it's spot on.
Right.
So a little bit of an insider's view for sure.
Yeah, and I think so. I mean, I guess back to your book idea is one of the things that we used to say to people is there a business around your book, or is the book in a business? And I think that's the biggest problem with marketing when they come to marketing a book is like, did you write this book and now you've got no idea really what happens next? And that's typically what we talk about, the customer journey.
Well, even with publishers, right? The publishers aren't actually good at marketing. The publishers.
No, that's why they're called publishers, not marketers, by the way.
Yeah. So they're supposed to be your financier, which maybe they do okay, maybe not. And then they're supposed to be, the lots of promises around marketing. The irony is, I think their math is worse than venture capital. Right. So I think the number of authors they sign up twice a year for the big publishing seasons, and they're looking for the genie in the bottle.
Yes.
Right. And they're just trying to depict the math. I think the math is probably a little bit less than venture capital, which is a little scary, at least from an author's perspective.
Yeah, I had a bit of an argument with a potential author a while back about, hybrid publishing, whether they should self-publish or whether they should go to a publisher. And I said, you do understand that they're playing probably, well, you would hope the 80-20 rule, but more like, the 99-1 rule, really, that they're looking for this big one. And then
I think it's closer to the 99-1 for sure.
Yeah, and I said, you obviously have never been involved in those guys, so you know exactly what's going to happen. He's like, no, that's not true. It's like, well, go find out yourself then, because it's like any other business model, I guess, at the end of the day. Like you put out the products you hope you're going to sell, and then the market doesn't buy it, you pivot to something else. Like that's how it works, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's some interesting hybrid publishers too. Though I have to say, I have a friend who came out of the publishing industry and who knows me well, and his comment was, Dave, don't try to fix this. There's no money in it. And I'm like, duly noted. So as much as the publishing process is wacky, the answer is fixing it's super hard, because there's just not much. It's one of the things I talk about in the book, John, is the idea of there's 11 frameworks I've outlined in the book for what makes a good idea. And one of them is this concept of an ecosystem, right? So I had a chance to sit in on Uber Elevate, which is their flying car conference, right? Which is really eVTOLs. Super interesting idea. And they had people from the government there and people from Los Angeles City and County there. And they had Bell Helicopters there and people who made, eVTOLs. And what Uber had done is they had looked at this whole thing as an ecosystem and said, well, we need somebody to build eVTOLs. We need somebody to train pilots. We need somebody to get power to the top of these parking garages. And they looked at the whole ecosystem and said, we can make money here, 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 and here. Everywhere else, we're going to find partners. Right. And it's a brilliant strategy. I mean, it's been a tough one, obviously, to do, because the tech isn't quite there yet. But we're seeing some brilliant electric vertical and takeoff helicopters, basically. But yeah, the ecosystem view is really interesting, because you have to look at it and say, most of us as founders look at it and they're like, oh, this is a problem. True. Is there any money in solving that problem?
Yes.
So I kind of look at those as like, it's kind of 1A and 1B. It's not even 1 and 2. It's like 1A and 1B. Yeah. So yes, it's a problem. Knowing what I know now, I grew my first company from 0 to 32 million in sales in 4 years.
Nice.
I would never touch that market again, ever.
Do you want simple and effective ways to get started that don't cost a fortune in time and money? Discover the best steps for each strategy we teach and the most important areas to focus on, and even to connect with your best customers and grow an online community. Grab your free copy of Startup Secrets for Entrepreneurs at startupsecrets.show. You learned a hard lesson, right?
Oh my God, it was incredibly hard to make money at. We had, the company who bought us did $1.2 billion, but our two biggest competitors were 13 and 15 billion.
Right.
So as we were going out to market, they're like, we're just going to lower our prices and drive you out of business, right? And they're like, how long can they last, right? So it was just a rough market, but knowing what I know now, I'd look at it and go like, nah, don't want to do it.
Yeah. So what do you see the future in startups? I spoke to a guy yesterday. I did an interview, a Frenchman, and he was it's quite amazing. He wrote a business plan at Web School, I think he called it. I'm not sure exactly where that was, but wrote this business plan about how to start a business, create a website, this model of what he was going to do. And it got so popular, he actually wrote it and actually launched a business. It's called livestorm.co. And it's like, and then he's got 130 employees 5 years later. Like it's almost like it. And I guess he kind of sugarcoats it a bit. There's probably a lot of challenges and journeys in there, but the interesting thing about it was he wrote a proper business plan. He built a mock-up website. He did all the initial stuff that most startup entrepreneurs never do. They just get a good idea and then go with it, right? And they never really look at that scenario. But he was getting people from his uni or whatever saying, "Hey, look, this is interesting. Can I use it?" And so they actually built something. And now I think he's got like 5,000 users. So, you look at that and you think, oh, you started it the right way because you knew no better. You weren't told that you had to do it this way and that's the way you're going to succeed in business. He did it as a school project, right? He just followed the math, right? Followed the rules in terms of what he had to do.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you talk about the school version, I think when I look at most undergraduate programs, right? So, and I get a chance to hang out with some of those, and I love those, right? Because there's so much youthful idealism, but generally speaking, there's 4 problems they're solving, right? Dating, books, food, and liquor. Those are the 4 problems.
Yeah, true.
Now, there has been some blockbuster hits. You mentioned Facebook earlier. There's clearly been some blockbuster hits around all of those categories, Snapchat, etc. Most adult learners are bringing some sort of problem to bear because they're familiar with a particular market and a particular problem and friction. So, they're coming at it from a standpoint of like, how do I take friction out of this market, or how do I simplify this thing, or how do I make this data set more accessible and less opaque? But yeah, I love working with, there's a thing here in the US called iCores, which is the University of Washington I spoke at last week and walking through, here are the 14 revenue models and here's what you need to know about. And the teams there are really interesting because they're folks at different points in their career. And they're really like, oh, I think this is a problem. I'm like, okay, let's go prove it, right? So to your point, build a prototype, go do customer development interviews. Here's how you do them, right? So one of the things I outline in the book is I'm very much focused on the what and the how. There's lots of people who've done amazing work around, why do you want to do this?
Yes.
So I always point those folks that way and say, you need to figure out your why.
Yes. Which
when you
people
figure
don't
that
necessarily do either, right? The why comes later sometimes.
Yeah, I want to be a billionaire, which is a horrible idea, right? Yeah. That's not the criteria I would look at and say that's a good answer to that question. Now, a lot of us during the recession, a lot of people had that whole like, I need to go create my own job. Totally a legit reason to go do that. But you still want to make sure that you can find the way to make, if you're in a service business, the answer is it's a little bit easier, right? Because there's no thing as service market fit, right? People buy services from other people all the time. The question is, are they going to buy them from you at the right price? Yeah. Now, product market fit, however, is people will say it's mystical or it's thing, you'll know it when you see it. And the answer is product market fit is just math. So sorry to burst the bubble for the VCs who've made it a mystery, right? But if I have leading indicators and I have lagging indicators for product market fit. The lagging indicators are things like, how disappointed would I be if I don't get to use this, and how profitable is it, and what's my lifetime value? The leading indicators are things like, how much traffic am I getting either at my site or at the app store? How many people are converting? Is that time going down? Is my average revenue per user going up? Like all of those are leading indicators and they're just math, right? So it always kind of frustrates me when I hear a VC who's never run a business say, oh, you'll know it when you see it, which is just the Supreme Court in the US said that about pornography.
I think actually Apple says that about their apps. So when you present an app to the App Store, Apple say, we've got enough fart apps. They actually wrote it in their terms and conditions. I don't know if it's still there. It says, we've got enough fart apps. Please don't submit any more. And our criteria is we'll know it when we see it. Yeah.
And the funny thing is there's so many training schools and code schools and universities teaching, development. One of the things you have to do is submit an app to the App Store in order to pass the class. Right. So you end up with tons of duplicate apps of all kinds of things.
Yeah, it's kind of a mess, isn't it?
Totally.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting point. I think a lot of businesses, when I look at them, they don't have a marketing problem; they have a math problem. Right? They haven't really got the math right, and so the conversion cost to get a customer and all those sorts of things is the hard part. And I think the other thing I see is they try to sell too many things, and so is there a sort of it's almost like it's kind of weird. Like I see with any sort of business, to be successful, you should be creative, and all that sort of stuff should happen in that process. But the reality is that most of these very successful businesses are boring as, right? Uber is technically boring as, like they just sell one thing, although they're obviously expanding, but they just do one thing. They do one thing over and over and over again, and I think for an entrepreneur can be quite boring, so they destroy it by accident, because it's boring, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of us have adult onset ADD for sure. So, and most of the big unicorn companies we've seen over the last 5 years have really gone after new and nascent markets. So Airbnb and Uber for sure, they were building something really new, but they were launching it into a new market. So I think the vision that they had around like, hey, we think this can actually change the market. As an investor, I kind of look at that one now and go like, do I really believe that or not? Right? Do I think, like, I may not agree with you, but I think that are you a visionary or not? Right? I always try to encourage founders not to put visionary entrepreneur onto their LinkedIn profile. I think the answer is maybe, like, if you've had a significant exit, I think you can do that. Most of us that had significant exits are like, yeah, we're still figuring this out, right?
Yeah,
And
most people will say that, right?
What's that?
Most people will say that they're an expert in what they just did. They probably
Right.
can't even teach someone how to do what they just did half the time.
I think somebody went to a seminar and said, hey, put philanthropist on your profile because that's aspirationally what you want to be. And I'm like, no, I know they're not. Like, that's just dumb. So don't do that.
And you've got to be able to spell it as well, right?
Exactly.
So where do you see like the next big things in what you see? Like, do you see some big kind of ideas coming forward? And I guess the pandemic has created an interesting kind of mix of 10 years.
Oh, yeah. Massive headwinds and massive tailwinds. Well, I'll give you a couple of categories that are super interesting, not verticals, but I think the thing we see in no code, so Bubble, the tools like IFTTT, and where you can really, as a non-coder, really put something together in this, what I would call the API economy, where it's really taking something that is less about code and more about connection and knowledge of the market. So those are super interesting because I think what will happen with those is it's going to bring the cost of building the product down, just like Amazon brought the cost of hardware down. So I think there are ideas that used to not be viable that will become viable because bringing the cost of development down. I think that's super interesting as a category. I think the headwinds, tailwinds question, like I was working with a company that does virtual events, right? And the combination now of hybrid events, and they did one for a big company the largest in-person event that company had ever done was 40,000 people, and they did 140,000 people. Wow. Right. And their growth numbers are ridiculous. Right. So if you haven't built that platform already, you're probably behind. So I wouldn't say now's a good time to go build that. But when I think about the trend, to your point, post recovery, I think there's going to be some super interesting travel categories that are popping up. I think as people who are outside the US market and look, like, for example, in MENA and Middle East, I'm a huge fan of copycats. Because in the US, when we raise money, the VCs are like, Dave, focus on the US. You got plenty of runway here, which means you have a 7-year head start of greenfield before I get to MENA and say, oh, who's really figured out the unit economics on this? Because we'll just put in our stack, but they really need to figure out the marketing, right? So for some of those companies, the answer is going to be a great exit in 5 or 6 years. So those ones to me are super exciting. And I do like the emerging markets. I think the places where, we used to have a tech hub, because I'm in Seattle, but, people are going to work remotely from now on. And it's not going to matter where you are. I loved that idea before because with Startup Weekend, we were very distributed and we work with 5,500 volunteers all over the world. So, but now the idea of like both command and control management, right? As well as like, I just want the best people I can find in the world, right? Becomes a really interesting opportunity as well. So I think we're in for kind of an exciting time, right? I'm perpetually glass half full, maybe 3/4 full. That's my nature.
Yeah. And I mean, I think back of a business partner I had that cost me a lot of money. But his business model was that he had an office, which is basically just one large room, and the desks were around the room. And he sat virtually off the side there, so he could see everybody's screens. And that was his way of doing business. So he'd make sure everybody was working because he'd look up and see that they were working. And that was his whole way of doing business. And I thought it was quite bizarre because of my business, we had a lot of people like in cubicles and offices and things like that. Yep. And it's just kind of bizarre, but that was his model. Like if he could see them not working, he assumed they were working, right?
Yeah, it's crazy. I think that, we're seeing people start to go back to work here in September in Seattle in the Northwest. and we'll see how it comes together. But I think there's a lot of people, you know, we've heard, I don't know if you've heard the rage quitting examples, but there's lots of people who are like, I'm done.
Not coming back.
Yeah. At least not coming back there. Like I may go to work at the zoo, but I'm not coming back there. And the company is very much a, you know, when I look at Glassdoor, the evaluation sites of people who are saying, hey, listen, how did this company rank? Surviving the pandemic and ended up with really some super high numbers or super low numbers, depending on how well the management was.
Yeah, and I think if you can survive that, you must survive anything, right?
Yeah, one of my companies did, like we had last year was our best year ever. This year's our topped out last year. And oh boy, when we entered into it, it was partially because they survived 2008, right? So they were quick to move and make good decisions. And, you know, all of those things really mattered. You needed runway.
And I think the biggest thing in I think the world of startup or entrepreneurship is that there's no perfect time to do anything. It's not like and there's always something around the corner that's going to get you. So you've always got to be in that situation where you've got to have some sort of way of navigating it. And sometimes it's bad luck. Sometimes things come along that you just can't do anything about. I mean, if you just started a new restaurant and you just get stuck in lockdown and that's the end of you, well, that wasn't your fault. Totally. But the reality is that, you know, unless you can pivot to takeaway or something like that, you're in big trouble. So, you know, you couldn't see that one coming, you know, ultimately. Yeah, for sure. I was on a panel a few years ago with somebody, a VC, and he's like, well, you know, I think economic downturns are good because, you know, the prices are less and people can do blah. And I kind of chuckled, and I probably shouldn't have chuckled as much out loud as I did. And I said, you know, the founders I know are compelled to go pursue an idea. And it doesn't matter the timing in many cases, right? You'll be talking about it. You're like, don't do it now. You have a new baby, right? Or whatever it is, right? Yeah. But my observation of founders is generally most of us are compelled to go pursue an idea. Yes. And timing be damned, right? We kind of look at it and we're like, no, this is I got to go fix this thing, or I got to go do this thing. So I always try to temper that with passion is super critical, but it's not sufficient. So you need to do math too. It is a commodity, really, at the end of the day, I think. Yeah. And I'm glad you're enthusiastic, and I don't want to rain on your parade, but do that and a little bit of math. Yes. Because you'll learn like, oh, can I actually buy customers at reasonable economics and expect a return? And the answer is I can do that test before I write a single line of code. Yes. Okay? So there's lots of ways you can test that in advance. Yeah. And I think that's the biggest challenge, I guess, is the testing, because you get so enthusiastic. Do you want to go build that house? You don't actually want to build any plans. You're just going to build that house and start whacking rooms in, right? And you don't want to talk to the inspector who says, you can't build it that way. That way will fail, right? Someone's going to die. Yep. If you don't put a roof on it. I really appreciate your time, Dave. I bet we could talk for hours on this, but I really appreciate your insight. And it's, you know, I think at the end of the day, it's a fantastic idea. I think math is the biggest challenge with most people, I think. And I think they should go. And your book's called Trajectory Startups, and we'll put a link up there on the. And I'll make sure I post the link for the free excerpt for the book too. So if you're just after the revenue models, you can definitely find that there too. We've created a free excerpt for it. So excellent. Thanks for the time. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. That's a wrap on another awesome episode for the Startup Secret Show for entrepreneurs. Just before you go, if you like this episode, we'd be very grateful for a 5-star review. Please also consider recommending the show to a friend or two. Make sure you subscribe for future episodes at startupsecrets.show right now. Until next time, if you're an entrepreneur, make a start on your next great business idea today.